The rain pounded against the windshield as Richard Callahan gripped the steering wheel. His jaw clenched in frustration. The night had been long. Another tedious business meeting filled with empty words and forced smiles. He was tired, drained, and eager to retreat to the solitude of his sprawling mansion, where silence was his only company. As his black Aston Martin glided down the deserted road, headlights slicing through the thick curtain of rain, something darted into his periphery. A dark shape, small and frail, lay motionless on the sidewalk just ahead. His pulse quickened. What the? He slammed the brakes, tires screeching against the wet pavement as the car came to a sharp halt, mere feet from the figure. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. Heart pounding. He threw open the door and stepped out, the cold rain drenching him instantly. Lying on the ground was a child, a girl no older than 10, curled up on the pavement like a broken doll. Her clothes were soaked, her face was ghostly pale, and her thin arms trembled violently. But it was her stomach that made his breath hitch. It was distended and swollen in a way that seemed unnatural for a girl her age. Richard hesitated, instinct screaming at him to walk away. He was not a man who interfered in the affairs of others. He had spent years building walls around himself, ensuring that nothing and no one could reach them. But something about this girl, her fragility, the unnatural stillness of her small frame, sent a rare pang through his chest. He knelt beside her, reaching out with hesitant fingers. Cold, ice cold. Hey, he said, shaking her shoulder gently. No response. He swallowed, glancing around. The street was deserted. No one was coming to help. His grip tightened on her arm. Kid, can you hear me? A faint movement, her lips trembling violently, barely parted. Then in a voice so weak it was almost lost in the rain, she whispered, H, help me. Richard froze. For the first time in years, something akin to panic gripped him. He had heard those words before, a memory buried deep, locked away. But now is not the time for ghosts. He acted on impulse, scooping the girl into his arms. He was startled by how weightless she was, as if she were nothing but skin and bones wrapped in drenched fabric. Her head lolled against his chest. Her breath is ragged and shallow. Stay awake, kid, he muttered, striding toward his car. Don't you dare die on me? The girl's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. She looked up at him, her gaze glassy and unfocused. Her lips parted once more, forming a single fragile plea before her body went limp in his arms. Save me. Richard, stomach clenched as he threw open the car door and carefully placed her in the passenger seat as he sped toward the hospital. Rain hammering the windshield, one unsettling thought gnawed at the edges of his mind. For the first time in a long time, he was afraid. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air as Richard paced the length of the hospital hallway. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the polished tiles. His suit was still damp from the rain, but he hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on the small, frail girl lying unconscious in the emergency room. He wasn't sure why he had brought her here. It wasn't his problem. He had never been one to involve himself in the affairs of strangers, let alone children. But the memory of her whisper, "Save me," lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't shake. A door creaked open. Mr. Callahan, a middle-aged doctor in a white coat, approached, his expression unreadable. Are you her guardian? Richard hesitated. No, he admitted. I found her unconscious on the street. The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. She is stable now, but she was severely dehydrated and malnourished. At first, we were concerned she might be pregnant, given the swelling in her abdomen. But after running tests, we determined it was due to kwashiorkor, a condition caused by extreme protein deficiency. Richard frowned. You're saying she's been starving? The doctor's expression darkened. Yes, and for a long time, her body has been breaking down muscles to survive. The swelling in her stomach is a result of fluid retention due to liver dysfunction. She's been living in severe neglect. A strange heavy weight settled in Richard's chest. No one came looking for her. He asked. The doctor shook his head. No ID, no emergency contacts, nothing. We've alerted social services, but cases like this." He sighed. She might be another lost child in the system. Richard glanced toward the room where the girl lay. Another lost child. He knew what that meant. Foster homes, group shelters, more suffering. He had seen enough news reports to know how those places operated. But why did he care? He wasn't responsible for her. He had done his part, hadn't he? "Can I see her?" he asked before he could stop himself. The doctor nodded. "She just woke up, but she's frightened. Maybe a familiar face will help." Richard wasn't sure if he qualified as a familiar face, but he followed the doctor through the door anyway. Inside, the girl sat on the hospital bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her wide, wary eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The moment she saw him, her body tensed. "You?" she murmured, her voice hoarse. Richard took a slow step forward. "Yeah, it's me." She flinched slightly, shrinking into herself. "I brought you here," he continued, keeping his tone measured, controlled. "You were in bad shape." The girl's fingers clenched around the thin hospital blanket. She looked down, refusing to meet his gaze. "You're safe now," Richard added, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. She didn't respond. Richard exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. What the hell was he doing here? He should leave. Let the professionals handle it. But instead, he found himself lowering into the chair beside her bed. "Did you get a name?" he asked. The girl hesitated before shaking her head. "You don't have one, or you don't want to tell me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Richard sighed. "Look, kid, I don't know what happened to you, but I'm not here to hurt you. The doctor said you haven't been eating for a long time. Do you have anyone? A family?" She remained silent. His patience, something he usually had in short supply, was already wearing thin. "All right," he muttered, standing. "Forget it. It's not my business anyway." He turned toward the door, but before he could take a step, a small voice stopped him. "Emily." Richard paused, looking over his shoulder. The girl swallowed hard. "My name is Emily." For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt a small flicker of something in his chest, something dangerously close to relief. Richard sat in the hospital room watching the girl, Emily, as she toyed with the blanket draped over her frail frame. She had barely spoken since whispering her name. And now, she said stiffly, her fingers fidgeting as if any wrong move would get her thrown out. She looked so small in that oversized hospital gown. Too small, too fragile. Richard cleared his throat. "Emily," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "That's a start." She didn't respond. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "The doctor said, you've been starving and your body is breaking down muscle to survive." He studied her face carefully. "Do you want to tell me how that happened?" Emily's body tensed for a long moment. Richard thought she wouldn't answer then. Barely above a whisper, she murmured, "I ran away." Richard's brows furrowed. "From where?" Emily swallowed hard, her gaze darting toward the window. The place I used to live. The shelter." Something about the way she said the word shelter made his stomach tighten. Richard had spent most of his life ignoring stories like this kid slipping through the cracks, growing up in places that called themselves homes, but were anything but. He had no patience for sob stories. Yet, as he sat here looking at this half-starved little girl with haunted eyes, he realized that this wasn't just a story. This was her reality. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. Emily hesitated before mumbling. A few weeks. A few weeks on the streets, alone." Something in Richard's chest tightened, though he forced his voice to remain even. "And before that, the shelter. You have lived there long?" Emily nodded slightly. "Since I was little. No parents?" A pause. Then she shook her head. Richard exhaled slowly. "No parents. No home. Just a system that had failed her like it had failed so many others." He knew he should stop asking questions. It wasn't his concern. And yet, before he could stop himself, he said, "Why'd you run?" Emily bit her lip. For the first time, Richard saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear. They were bad. She whispered. "The people who ran it." Richard's jaw tightened. Emily clutched the blanket tighter. "They never gave us enough food." She continued, her voice shaking. "Some days we wouldn't eat at all. They said we were too much trouble, that we cost too much money. But we knew they got money from people. They were supposed to take care of us, but they didn't. Richard stayed silent, letting her talk. They would lock us in our rooms if we complained. Sometimes they'd punish us. She winced at the word. If someone got sick, they wouldn't take them to the doctor. They'd just leave them. Richard felt his fingers clench against his knee. She took a trembling breath. One time I got in trouble for taking extra food. They said I had to go a whole week without eating. She looked down. Her voice is barely audible. I thought I was going to die. Richard's stomach twisted. He had seen hunger before. He had traveled the world and walked through cities where people begged for scraps. But he had never felt it. Not like this. Not in a child's voice. Raw and real and utterly broken. My belly got bigger. Emily continued, pressing a small hand against her abdomen. It started hurting all the time. The other kids thought I was sick, but no one helped me. She hesitated before whispering. Then one night, my friend didn't wake up. Richard's fingers curled into a fist. She was only 8. Emily choked out. She said she was tired and that her stomach hurt too. And then she was just gone. A heavy silence filled the room. Richard's chest ached in a way he couldn't explain. That's when I ran. Emily murmured, her voice hollow. I didn't care where I went. I just knew I had to get away. Richard exhaled sharply for the first time in years. Something cracked inside him. Emily had no one. She had been left to waste away, to suffer in silence until she couldn't anymore. And somehow, out of all the people in the world, she had ended up in his arms. Richard Callahan, a man who had spent his life avoiding attachments, had suddenly found himself holding the weight of one little girl's entire world. The decision was unlike anything Richard had ever made before. For years, his life had been meticulously structured diento ALS, investments and transactions. No complications, no attachments. But as he sat in the hospital room, watching Emily stir in her sleep, he knew he couldn't just walk away. The system would chew her up and spit her out again. She wouldn't survive it. So when the doctor asked if he wanted to sign as her temporary guardian, Richard didn't hesitate. The drive to his mansion was quiet. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze flickering nervously to him every few seconds. She didn't trust him. Not yet. When they arrived, she hesitated at the door. "You can go in," Richard said, motioning inside. Emily's fingers tightened around the hem of her oversized sweater. "You're not going to lock me in?" she asked softly. Richard stilled. "Ty." His throat tightened, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "No, Emily, no locks." She hesitated a moment longer before stepping inside. The house was enormous. Too big for one man, too cold for a child. But Emily didn't seem impressed by the wealth. She didn't run to explore. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself, as if she expected it all to be taken away. Richard watched her, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He had never wanted a child, yet now he had one, and he had no idea what to do with her. Days passed, then weeks. Richard brought in the best doctors. They put Emily on a strict nutrition plan, ran tests, and monitored her closely. Her body was weak, but it wasn't beyond repair. What took longer to heal was her mind. She barely spoke at first. She flinched when Richard moved too quickly. She never took more than she needed, even when given full meals. She ate cautiously, as if expecting it to be taken away. One night, Richard found her hiding food under her pillow. When he asked her about it, she looked down and whispered, just in case. Richard's chest ached, so he didn't scold her. Instead, the next morning, he filled a drawer in the kitchen with granola bars, fruit, and crackers. "This is for you," he said. "If you ever feel hungry, you don't have to ask. Just take it." Emily didn't say anything. But later that night, when she thought he wasn't looking, she opened the drawer and took an apple. Not to hide, but to eat. It was the first step. Little by little, she began to open up. She started sitting with him at breakfast. Her small fingers carefully spread butter on toast. She watched movies with him, silent at first, then slowly laughing at the funny parts. One afternoon, he came home to find her drawing at the kitchen table. "What's that?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then turned the paper toward him. It was a sketch of the house, but there in the front yard were two stick figures, one tall, one small, a man and a girl. Richard swallowed hard. "Is that me?" he asked. Emily looked down, fiddling with the pencil. Then, almost too softly to hear, she murmured, maybe Richard wasn't sure when it happened. When this fragile, terrified child started feeling like his responsibility. Like his. But he knew one thing. He wasn't letting her go. One Sunday afternoon, Richard took Emily grocery shopping. It was something normal, something families did. Emily had been doing better. She smiled more. She didn't flinch as often, but as they walked down the cereal aisle, everything changed. She froze. Richard was about to ask what was wrong when he saw it. The way her small hand started shaking. The way her face turned pale. Her wide eyes were fixed on a man across the store. A tall, broad-shouldered man. His back turned as he inspected a can of soup. Richard felt Emily's fingers grip his sleeve hard. Her breathing was shallow, too fast to panic. "Emily," he asked, crouching to meet her eye level. "What's wrong?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then, in a whisper so quiet he almost didn't hear it, she said it was him. "Richard?" Stomach dropped. Emily's voice trembled. "He's the one who locked me in." Richard had never considered himself an emotional man. He had built his empire on logic, precision, and ruthless efficiency. But as he held Emily's trembling hand in that grocery store, watching the color drain from her face, something inside him snapped. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't turn to look at the man she was pointing at. Instead, he wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the exit. Emily clung to him. Her breaths are uneven, her tiny frame trembling against his side. When they reached the car, he knelt in front of her. "Emily," he said carefully, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me everything. Who is he?" She squeezed her eyes shut, her fingers digging into the fabric of his coat. "That's Frank Dawson," she whispered. "He ran the shelter." Richard's jaw tightened. Emily took a shaky breath. He locked kids in the basement. If they were bad. He told us no one would believe us if we said anything. That no one cared about kids like us." Her voice broke. "He let some of them starve." Richard felt his hands curl into fists. She wasn't lying. He had seen the damage himself. The sunken cheeks, the hollow eyes, the fear that never really left her. But now he had a name, and Frank Dawson had no idea who he had just crossed. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Richard sat in his home office, phone pressed to his ear. "I need everything on a man named Frank Dawson," he told his private investigator. "He ran a shelter for kids. I want to know where he gets his funding, what he does with it, and who he's paying off." The investigator didn't hesitate. "Got it. I'll call you in the morning." Richard hung up and exhaled slowly. He had built his fortune breaking down corrupt systems. But this wasn't business. This was personal. The next day, when the investigator called back, Richard listened in grim silence. The shelter was a front. Frank Dawson had been embezzling money meant for the children. Donations and government funds that should have gone to food, clothes, and medical care had instead lined his pockets. And the worst part? No one had stopped him. He had connections and people in power who looked the other way. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. Not anymore. Richard didn't just want Dawson arrested. He wanted to burn his entire operation to the ground. He reached out to his legal team, his contacts in law enforcement, and his media connections. If there was one thing he had learned in business, it was that the right amount of pressure in the right places could crush anyone. By the end of the week, the police had enough evidence to move, and Richard wasn't going to sit back and watch. On a stormy night, just like the one when he first found Emily, Richard stood outside the shelter, watching as police cars surrounded the building. Officers stormed inside, breaking down doors and pulling terrified children from locked rooms. Some were thin, too thin. Some flinched at every loud noise, but all of them had one thing in common: they had been forgotten. Not anymore. Richard watched as Frank Dawson was dragged out in handcuffs, his face pale with rage and disbelief. The man locked eyes with him. "You did this?" He spat. Richard didn't blink. "You did this to yourself for the first time in his life." He felt something he hadn't expected. Not just anger, not just justice. Purpose. Richard should have known a man like Frank Dawson wouldn't go down easily. A week after the raid, as the legal process moved forward, Richard received an urgent phone call. Frank had escaped, The transport van taking him from county jail to a higher security facility had been ambushed. A bribe? A setup. The man who had tortured Emily and countless others was on the loose. Richard's blood ran cold. Emily. Without hesitation, he rushed home. Emily was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. When she saw his expression, she immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Richard knelt in front of her, his voice firm but calm. "Dawson got away, but I won't let him near you, I promise." She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She clenched her fists and straightened her spine. "Then let's stop him," she said. 2 days later, Frank was recaptured in a cheap motel trying to flee the state. This time there were no bribes, no loopholes, no way out. The evidence against him was overwhelming. At the trial, Richard sat beside Emily. His protective presence is unwavering. She was nervous, her fingers twisted, the fabric of her dress, her breath uneven. But when Frank was brought into the courtroom, shackled and dressed in an orange jumpsuit, she didn't look away. The prosecutor called her to the stand. Richard felt a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Then she glanced at him. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "You've got this." She took a deep breath, stood, and walked forward. The room fell silent as she settled into the witness chair. She was small, dwarfed by the size of the courtroom. But when she spoke, her voice was strong. "My name is Emily," she said, her hands gripping the sides of the chair. "I used to live at the Dawson home for children, but it wasn't a home." She told her story. The starvation, the punishments, the children who never made it out. Richard clenched his jaw as Dawson refused to meet her eyes. "The coward. I was scared to tell the truth," Emily admitted. "I thought no one would listen, but someone did." She turned slightly, her eyes landing on Richard. "And because of him, I'm not afraid anymore." Richard's heart clenched. For so long he had believed he was a man who only cared about himself. But as he watched this brave little girl stand tall, refusing to be a victim, he realized the truth. He had changed because of her. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Frank Dawson was sentenced to life in prison as the gavel struck. Emily exhaled a shaky, relieved breath. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. Steady and warm. "It's over," he said. Emily looked up at him and smiled. "No, it's just beginning." The adoption papers sat on Richard's desk, waiting for his signature. He stared at them for a long moment. The weight of what they meant settled deep in his chest. Months ago, he had been a man with no attachments, no family, and no reason to care about anyone but himself. Now, sitting across from him, eating a peanut butter sandwich at the kitchen counter, was the little girl who had changed everything. Emily. Amy. She had been through hell and back. Yet here she was, healthy, smiling, safe. She had started laughing more, trusting more. She no longer hoarded food. She had decorated her own room, filling it with drawings and books. And somehow his cold, empty house had become a home. Emily swung her legs under the stool and then looked up at him. "Are you going to sign it?" Richard smirked. "You are in a rush to be stuck with me forever." Emily grinned. "You're not so bad." Richard chuckled, shaking his head, then with a deep breath, he picked up the pen and signed his name. It was official. Emily Callahan, his daughter. That night, Richard and Emily sat across from each other at the dining table. For years, he had eaten his meals alone. But tonight, the seat across from him wasn't empty. Emily took a bite of her spaghetti and then wrinkled her nose. "You're a billionaire. Why can't we hire a better cook?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "You don't like my cooking?" Emily laughed. "This is your cooking?" He smirked. "Don't get used to it." She giggled, twirling her fork in her noodles. Then after a moment, she looked at him with a sincerity that hit him straight in the chest. "Thank you," she said softly. Richard set his fork down. "For what?" Emily shrugged. "For finding me. For keeping me for the first time in years." Richard Callahan felt truly whole. He reached across the table, ruffling her hair. "You saved me too, kid." Emily grinned, and as they ate their messy, overcooked dinner, Richard realized something for the first time in his life. He wasn't alone. He had a family, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. And so, against all odds, a hardened billionaire and a lost little girl found something neither of them had ever truly known. A family. Richard Callahan, once a man who lived only for himself, had discovered that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with. And Emily, a child who had spent her life believing she was unwanted, had finally found a place to call home. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected people can change our lives forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to soul-stirring stories for more emotional, inspiring, and unforgettable tales. Because sometimes a single act of kindness can rewrite someone's entire future.